Welcome to Conversations With, a podcast series exploring the people and practices shaping the impact of private philanthropy to benefit communities across Africa. Conversations With is produced by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, working to promote robust, effective, and responsive philanthropy and to build a network of informed, engaged, and connected funders. Visit the africagrantmakers.org website for program notes and to join our mailing list.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Niamani Mutima, and welcome to this briefing organized by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. Thank you for joining us. The internet connection from our colleagues in eSwatini is somewhat unstable this morning, but we hope that we'll be able to have this briefing without any interruption. So this is our second discussion, focusing on current events in eSwatini, formerly known as Swaziland, which is the second smallest country in Africa with a population of 1.3 million and a median age of 21. Civil society organizations in eSwatini face daunting challenges that are compounded by the recent protests against human rights violations and call for government reforms, and of course, the corona pandemic that has affected us globally. Our guests are joining us from eSwatini, and they will share their firsthand insights and perspectives about the challenges facing civil society organizations working under these conditions, and also what is needed to build a resiliency to not only survive, but to thrive. So I want to welcome Ashley and Melusi and Lomcebo. Thank you for making the time in your schedule to join us. So Ashley has agreed to moderate this session. So let me hand it over to you and to start the conversation.
Thanks, Niamani. I'm happy to moderate this call. I'm the coordinator of ACT Ubumbano, an organization that is based in South Africa, but I live and work here in eSwatini.
The people that we will hear from today are very actively involved in the broader civil society movement in eSwatini or Swaziland, depending on what your preference is. So basically, we're going to spend the next hour or so just trying to get a sense from Melusi Matsenjwa, who is a lawyer by training and works with one of the organizations in eSwatini. He's here in his own capacity as an activist in civil society. We'll also hear from Lomcebo Dlamini, who similarly will be speaking as an activist in civil society and in our own capacity. So, Melusi, the situation is it's in flux. But already one of the reasons we're having such dodgy internet connectivity is that every time there's a little bit of unrest, it seems that our internet bandwidth gets choked quite severely.
Colleagues, I'm Melusi Matsenjwa. I am a lawyer by profession, and I've been working in the civil society space for about 15, 18 years now. But as Ashley has said, I'm addressing this forum today in my private capacity and as a person who's within the space and who's worked and currently working within the civil society space in Eswatini. We definitely are a country in motion for at least the last 2 months now, given the unrest that erupted sometime towards the end of June, if I'm not mistaken. We do know that Eswatini operates a unique system of governance. There's been civil society voices for quite some time in Eswatini calling for democratic changes and for more pluralism in the political space. And because of COVID and a number of reasons, there seemed to be a lull in that kind of space until some activities or some events really that sort of sparked activism once again. And I think I'll just mention two. My colleague Lomcebo will also come in to assist to speak to how we found ourselves at the point that we're at right now as a country. So a couple of months ago, there is a young student, a student of the University of Eswatini, who was a law student, who died under mysterious circumstances. Now, there was widespread belief, looking at the circumstances of his death, that police may have had a hand in his death. So it raised a lot of questions. And of course, the colleagues of this young man, who's Niamani Mutima, at the University of Swaziland, immediately smelt a rat. They started protesting. They went to police to start demanding answers. The government did rise quite quickly to try to respond to that by putting in place an inquest, which is currently underway. Now, as the evidence is surfacing, already it does appear that something really did go amiss there. So after that, there was a call led initially by the students, and then civil society in its broader nature, latched on to that to say Parliament must do something about that. It was not an isolated case of police brutality. There had been other cases that had been reported before. So under the campaign #Justice for Thabani, students and civil society started demanding answers, started demanding Parliament to do something about that. And parliamentarians were then petitioned to respond to that and put pressure on the government to actually do a proper investigation to find out how this young man died. That particular campaign gained momentum to the point where 3 MPs in Parliament were quite vocal about that. And it escalated to something even bigger. The MPs were now calling for a more democratic government, in the sense that they were saying perhaps it is time that Eswatini has a prime minister that is not appointed by the king, so that that prime minister is accountable to the people. That led now to several petitions that were delivered in the various constituencies, which we call Kinkundla. Those petitions range from a number of issues, ranging from service delivery issues to that specific call of a democratically elected prime minister, to a number of other issues regarding justice for this young student who was killed in this manner. So that was quite unprecedented for a number of petitions of this nature to be delivered almost simultaneously throughout a number of days. The Prime Minister then, the acting Prime Minister, as he was then, decided he was going to issue a directive to stop delivery of those petitions in the various constituencies. But that announcement by government to stop delivery of those petitions really spurred a violent reaction from members of the public.
Lomcebo, welcome. And can I ask then that you also give us a sense of what your reading of the current political situation is, particularly identifying some of the challenges that it creates and where the opportunities perhaps might lie in the broader politics of Eswatini.
Thank you, Ashley. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I apologize for being late, but let me start here. One of the reasons I'm late is that you may or may not be aware that today was the bail hearing of the 2 MPs that were arrested. And so I had gone to try and access the High Court and observe what was happening over there. The situation on the street was tense, lots of police and security force presence. In fact, as I was returning at the place that we call the bus rank, where the public transport is, there was a lot of shooting right in front of my eyes. Somebody almost got shot by a soldier at close range. This might have been rubber bullets, but the fact that that kind of commotion and that kind of violence is happening, I think speakers, both Melusi and the ones last week, have mentioned that this is unprecedented. Now, where does this put civil society? First of all, the calls for democracy and the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms are not new in Swaziland or in Eswatini. As a member of civil society, I've been working in the space for the past 20 years or so. And there have been consistent calls for democratization, consistent calls for the respect of human rights. And these calls being made, unfortunately, to a government that is hostile to these things. And in many instances, as we have engaged with supporters both inside and outside the country, we as civil society have made the point of saying, does there have to be blood spilt before people take notice of what is happening in this so-called tiny kingdom that used to be called an oasis of peace between apartheid South Africa and warring Mozambique. And yet this peace that people were talking about was really the absence of overt violent conflict. But it has not been peace in the true sense. It merely has been a silence and a frustrated silence of the population. For the past decade or so, we have seen a deterioration in the living conditions of the ordinary Swazi person. So things like access to education, access to healthcare, access to other quality services has really deteriorated, while things like unemployment, poverty have increased over the years. And so obviously these things, together with the fact that human rights have not been respected, have created ingredients for this kind of conflict, in particular because there is such a wide difference, or there is such inequality. There are those that are the haves and are really not more than 20% of the population. And the difference between them and the have-nots is extremely stark. We have people in our rural areas that rely on food aid. We have people that are unable to have 3 meals a day, sometimes skipping a day because they want to try and ensure that the food will be enough for families. And so our government, our governing authorities have been perceived as insensitive to the plight of the people. In particular, the concerns have been with the royal family in terms of the extravagance of the way in which they live, the royal family in terms of entering into the economic space and the ownership of companies and participation in the private sector, in a way squeezing out your ordinary person who's trying to make a living. And so civil society within the space has been trying, one, to conduct civic education, because over the years there's been a deliberate suppression of political consciousness and a discouragement of civic participation. So attempt to do civic education, attempt to promote human rights through advocacy, through strategic litigation, through engaging with international and regional partners, in particular bodies such as SADC, bodies such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as well as the United Nations, to bring to their attention this issue. As I mentioned, our state is very hostile, and so as human rights defenders, the space has been gradually shrinking for civil society to do its work. And so there have been attempts to shut down organizations. There have also been attempts to deny organizations registration because they are perceived as promoting aims that are going to be disruptive to the so-called peace of Swaziland. There has been reprisals against human rights defenders, harassment, intimidation, surveillance, arrest, detention, and some have been killed in police custody. And so as we try to do our work within this shrinking space, there is also this reality that your personal security and life is at risk. Ashley, you asked the question about the challenges that this presents. Obviously, within such a space, it is difficult, firstly, to penetrate communities. Our communities are headed by chiefs. And for you to be able, what has happened over the years is that for you to be able to have any community activity, you have to go through the traditional authorities. And if you are going to be talking about human rights, democracy, or anything like that, that you are denied entry into those communities. And if you are labeled as problematic, community members themselves are afraid to associate with you because there is the risk that they themselves may be evicted from their homes. You also have the challenge of a judiciary that is not independent. And so in as much as I mentioned that we have tried to do strategic litigation, a lot of the cases or the judgments that have come out from the courts have not been progressive in their interpretation of the law. Even though we do have a Bill of Rights in our 2005 Constitution, but the judgments of the courts have been very regressive when you look at human rights. In fact, our judges are there's interference from government, from the traditional authorities, and therefore they do not carry out their duties independently or impartially. Although that's the case, there are a number of opportunities, I believe, because of this heightened activity. The calls for dialogue around the situation in the country, around the democratic transformation of the country, and the fact that it really cannot be postponed any longer. I think that message is coming out loud and clear. even though, as Melusi mentioned, our king and the government have been trying not to acknowledge it. But I think what has happened in recent weeks is actually exposing the lie that they have been telling, that everything is peaceful. And so there is an opportunity here to advocate through engaging even with other bodies for this national dialogue, which we believe should be inclusive. We believe that the different sectors of our society should be able to come to the table and to talk about what do we want a democratic Eswatini to look like? What do we want the conditions of the people to look like so that they don't remain under this current regime?
Thanks very much, Lomcebo. But I want to take us to maybe looking at where we've got some say, right, as civil society. So what is the state? How ready is civil society to take up these opportunities? What challenges are you facing as Swazi civil society? And are there opportunities perhaps to try and engineer some change, particularly in what you call these calls for dialogue? Is it possible that civil society can have an impact? Is it open to working with other sectors of society, such as political parties, the private sector? And to what extent, perhaps, is there a role for the international community to play, particularly in pushing the regime towards a more open stance? Melusi, can I ask you to lead us off on that round of reflections? Ask Lomcebo to come in, and then we'll maybe open it up for discussion after that.
Thank you so much, Ashley. There definitely are both challenges and opportunities there, Ashley. To start with, I think, let me reflect briefly on the challenges. I think we still have a somewhat fragmented civil society. If you want to speak of civil society in Swaziland, most people think we're just speaking of NGOs, and those would be predominantly those organized under the Coordination of Non-Governmental Organizations, CANGO. And there, while there's quite a number of organizations that are active, there aren't so many that have an appetite programmatically to deal with these issues that we are speaking to, governance and democratic issues, even though there is a consortium there. I tried to do a bit of research myself a couple of days ago to find out the state of that consortium, which should be very active in matters like this. There are only a handful of organizations, unfortunately, that are able really to be visible. So that speaks to a need to have more organizations have an appetite to talk to these issues of good governance and democratization. So that for me is quite an issue. And then you have those organizations that are not part of CANGO, that are in existence in Eswatini, that do not subscribe to CANGO, but they're doing work, and it's quite difficult to know where they're working and what they're doing. It's quite a handful of those as well. So I think that kind of fragmentation does pose a challenge. Some of those organizations, unfortunately, are products as it were, auxiliary organs of some known political organizations or political parties, some of which are banned. So it really gives a bit of trepidation for some organizations to openly coalesce with them on some issues for fear of being at variance with the Suppression of Terrorism Act, which says any association with those organizations may invite the wrath of the law. So that for me is a challenge. And the fact that most of our organizations or civil society, we tend to be program-based. You do not have a situation where a funder or an organization that is willing to assist you come to you and say, here is so many dollars, what are the needs that must be addressed? More often than not, to survive as civil society, we need to respond to calls for proposals that may take us to a direction that may not necessarily be, needs-based. So we have a situation where the help that comes from the international community is quite prescriptive as to what has to be done and how it has to be done. And then quickly moving on to the opportunities, I still think this era or this epoch in our history allows us to invest a bit more in community mobilization. We need now to have programs that allow communities to rise and take up these issues themselves. For a long time, we've been doing human rights programs where we just go to communities, talk to them about the theory of human rights, and off we go, we tick a box. Now we need more of an accompaniment kind of a setup where we are assisting organizations take up these issues and are able to lobby and run with those issues. And then issues of course, psychosocial support. There's a number of people that have been disturbed. There's not going to be any much help from the government we can expect for those who have lost relatives, for those who have been tortured. So we need help in the area of psychosocial support for those that have been affected by this, and that will continue to be affected. We could also do with help with the investigations of those killings that have happened. The Prime Minister, in his inaugural speech in Parliament yesterday, spoke of government's commitment to ensure that there's investigation of these matters. But we know that's not going to happen. Our civil society, lastly, will need also to be assisted with capacity so that they're able to, strengthen internal democracy and are able to be strengthened as outfits that can be alive and be resilient throughout this period. Because governments may want to, attack them directly to make sure they're not getting the support that they need to infiltrate them. So they'll need to be assisted to reflect also in experiences of the region. In Zimbabwe, for instance, how to operate in a changing situation like this, where now the regime is becoming more repressive. How to mobilize, how to write out and package our stories and let the world know what we're going through. Thank you.
Thanks, Melusi. Lomcebo, do you want to come in on that?
Thanks, Ashley. I mean, just quickly, I think the fragmentation, that Melusi mentions, I think right now, one of the key challenges I think we're facing is how to really unify around a key message. There are many players in this. There are the political parties who are calling for multi-party democracy. They are those who are calling for a constitutional monarch. There are those that are saying away with the monarchy altogether. There are groups that are saying, you know what, we just want to be able to live securely, our families to be able to access services, and government is not doing that. And so we want greater accountability. And so there are all of these multiple interests that have kind of come together to create this dissatisfaction that has culminated in these actions. But I think one of the key things that we really need to do is try and negotiate amongst ourselves, laying aside the partisan differences that might be there, to say this is not the moment for particular partisan positions. This is the moment to look at those things that are common amongst us and to push those things. And I think what is common is obviously the democratization of the country broadly as a principle, which obviously is a process in itself. What is common is this issue of removing of the king from executive power and absolute power, and giving that power to the people through their elected government. And so I think civil society, there's a lot of contestation at the moment as to what are we pushing forward. And so coming together around those key unifying points so that it is not as easy, to divide the movement as it would be. I think in terms of opportunities, look, the reality is that government has dug its heels in, particularly after the speech of the king. And one of the things that we know very well is that our authorities put a lot of stock in their international image and what the world thinks, rather than what's happening internally. And so voices from outside, from the international community, from intergovernmental bodies, from the diplomatic corps, those are very critical. You asked as well about whether civil society is willing to engage with other actors, both inside and outside the country. Definitely. One of the key sectors we are concerned about is the business community. The business community tends to be a bit reticent about engaging or linking up with civil society because we've got a small market in eSwatini, and government and the authorities provide customer base for these businesses. And so there is usually a reluctance for them to engage as strongly. But if we can bring them on board, economic recovery right now for our government, particularly with the effects of COVID, coming into a context where already our economy was performing badly, that drive around, improving the economy could be an opportunity. I know one of the things our government seeks to do is to access the Millennium Challenge Corporation funding. And that Millennium Challenge Corporation funding comes with a number of indicators, including the degree to which that country is ruling justly, the degree to which there is gender equality, the degree to which there are social services provided. And in every grading, eSwatini has failed and therefore cannot access this funding. So now that they want to, they have to turn around some of these indicators. And that is an opportunity to highlight that if you open up civil and political freedoms, if you promote human rights, then you may be able to access development funding. And at the moment, our eligibility to AGOA is under threat. And if that happens, we're sliding deeper into economic problems, and government does not want to do that. And so pressure from those angles also assists.
Thanks very much, Lomcebo. I think that's a very comprehensive laying out of the issues. I'm going to hand over to Niamani because I see there's quite a bit of conversation in the chat box. Niamani?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Melusi, and thank you, Lomcebo. I think you really laid out some important issues. So our colleague has posed two questions. One, what are the other alternatives to access communities as the chiefs are still in control of these communities? And there's been a huge crackdown on activists. So how can we protect human rights defenders? What are some of the mechanisms that are in place and what else can be done? So let me throw those two questions out for our guests to respond to. Melusi, do you want to respond to either of those questions?
Thank you very much, Niamani. I'll make an attempt then. Well, in terms of accessing communities, the truth is there are some civil society organizations that are still working in communities. Well, especially before this whole COVID-19 situation, there still were opportunities for communities to be accessed. It all depends on how you package yourself and how you package the information. I've worked, for instance, for an organization that has been able to go and speak about human rights in their broader form at communities. So, of course, they are not all the same. Others will insist really on going about, on being quite difficult. They want to know what you'll be talking about. And in some instances, even as you travel to those communities, there may be cops already waiting for you, roadblocks, checking what are you going to say, what material are you bringing. So it's a matter of tact, really. But communities are not completely inaccessible. What we can anticipate going forward, though, is that space may start to close down. But the young people who are now quite politicized and conscientized may not allow for a closing of those spaces. So we still need to test the waters as regards that area, because after all that has happened, we do not anticipate that they'll want to continue with the laissez-faire kind of an affair where anyone can just go in and say anything. So police presence will be expected. So we are yet to see really what the attitude of the government will be. And then around how do we protect our human rights defenders, I think we need more programs that speak to creating a community of these defenders so that they are known and they are able really to actually inform each other whenever any one of them is under threat. We need specific programs that will talk to, first of all, who is a human rights defender? How do we know that they're under threat and how do we respond to that? We really may need to reflect and learn from other societies that have gone through situations like this to understand what has happened, how they've been able to build organizations and communities where they're able to protect each other, they're able to defend each other.
Lomcebo, can I ask you to respond to the questions raised?
Thanks, Niamani. Just quickly with the communities, I think one strategy that we have used in the organizations that I've worked with is that amongst the members are so-called non-threatening organizations or community-based organizations. And so you will have maybe a group of women who are in a self-help group. Their focus might be on income generation or on gender-based violence, and you enter through them to initially talk about those specific issues, like I say, that seem to be non-threatening. There are churches that hold meetings and have church groups. We enter through those member organizations. If a church calls its own meeting, then, they're not going to shut down that meeting. Although, as Melusi has pointed out, you can expect plainclothes policemen to be present as part of those community members. And so we have tried to adapt to see if we can enter communities in other ways, not necessarily revealing the clear human rights and democratic civic education, but coming in through the issues of concern and then building up to those human rights and democracy issues. And then in terms of human rights defenders, at the moment, I know that the Southern African Human Rights Defenders Network is trying to look at this issue. It's a relatively new one for us in eSwatini, taking care of human rights defenders, even though the reprisals against them have been happening, ever since at least I've been in the field. And so I think it's issues around rapid response when somebody is under threat, so that, once that has been highlighted, there's a rapid response either around getting that person to safety, away from where they can be accessed, whether it's in or out of the country, providing legal support for some of these charges which are spurious, really. So in that sense, also providing for the psychosocial support that Melusi was talking about within the families as well, because it's not just about the human rights defenders as individuals. Our system is very clever in terms of then targeting your family and putting pressure on your family, so that they then put pressure on you to stop the work that you're doing. And so I think that would also be key in terms of providing support to human rights defenders, so that they know that even if they, for whatever reason, find themselves arrested, detained, or even, lose their lives, there will be that psychosocial support to address the trauma that their families are going through.
Thank you, Lomcebo. We also have a question that came in prior to the session on email that wanted to know what's the impact of the coronavirus in eSwatini on civil society, and about the access to both treatment and vaccines. So Melusi or Lomcebo or Ashley, would either of you would like to respond to that?
A quick one from me, Niamani, would be that this pandemic has had serious repercussions and negative impact on the kind of work civil society is doing, especially those that are community-based. So many of the activities tend to hinge around community meetings, community gatherings, and in the absence of that, very little gets to be done. The regulations have been quite restrictive for quite some time, even though they've been relaxed over time. But for the longest, especially last year and the better part of this year, there were huge restrictions on the number of gatherings. So that meant people could not, be reached out through their traditional means. And civil society organizations have had to quickly try to adapt and see how they use, other means to communicate, social media and other platforms such as these, which are not so easy to use when you're going to be focusing your programs on what we call grassroots people. There's the issue of connectivity in some areas. Issues of internet is still not quite, we don't have a wide coverage of that. And the cost associated with data, that becomes a huge problem. So some civil society organizations really have had to lose some funds, really, when they failed to re-engineer their programs in such a way that they're still able to have impact and do their work without having to have physical meetings. So that is a problem. It also bothers even those of us working in towns. There'll always be issues around access to proper bandwidth and issues of technical glitches that really does pose a huge hindrance. So some civil society organizations, NGOs, have had to close shop, unfortunately, because of that, because now some funders have decided to withdraw their funds, seeing that the context of the situation would not allow for proper implementation. So that means a shrinking of that space once again. So yeah, I think I would want to talk about that long term.
And in terms of COVID, we are currently, I suppose, at the beginning stages of the third wave. And we have seen a growth in the number of daily infections, as well as an increase in the deaths. In terms of vaccines, at the moment, government has, in fact, just the other day, I think the day before yesterday, government received a consignment of vaccines from the United States of America. What has been happening is that they started vaccines with the elderly. And I understand that with this latest batch of vaccines, they will be moving on to the frontline workers and then possibly the teachers. But at the moment, there hasn't been any kind of broad-based vaccination plan that we are aware of or that will then target other segments of the population. Although we are being encouraged to register, but at the moment, the availability of these medicines and government's rollout plan is not yet reaching the rest of the population.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of this session, and I want to give all three of you, including you, Ashley, I know you've been serving in a role as moderator, but for any closing thoughts. We've organized this session because we felt that it was important to, one, highlight what's going on in eSwatini. Two, it's not a country, particularly for the American public, that receives a lot of notice in terms of what's going on. But in terms of what those in philanthropy who are focusing on supporting communities across Africa, we feel that it's important for them to understand what's going on. And I'm really sorry to hear, Melusi, you say that funders are choosing to rescind funds for activities that are not able to take place, because we all know that in the context of the pandemic, all of us are working in seclusion and working virtually and not being able to go out. So let me first turn to you, Lomcebo, for any closing comments that you may have for us.
Thank you, Niamani. I think for me, it would just be firstly to appreciate this forum and to appreciate the interest in spreading the message. I really think that as whatever can be done, particularly from the international community, to put pressure on the state will be very useful, because it's very easy for them to pretend like nothing is happening, in as much as internally there may be a lot of activity. So critical is the international voice on this, that this is not acceptable, and Eswatini should find a peaceful way of resolving its issues. And then, of course, around civil society, I think we've tried to lay out some of the challenges being faced. And so as we continue with this unrest, I think from our perspective as civil society, as we, disseminate the information, it would be quite useful that dissemination is also, taken forward by the people that we share the information with. And then, of course, the key issues around the needs of capacity building for civil society as it does this work, and the protection of human rights defenders.
Melusi?
Thank you so much, Niamani. I think I also want to reiterate Lomcebo's sentiments in appreciating this very important forum. It's quite exciting, the reach that you have, and also for having chosen us to sort of give you a bit of an insight into what is happening here. I think what we want to say, unflinchingly, is that Eswatini needs the world right now. We might not have so much to offer, but I think we are desperately in need of as much support as we can get, especially from the audiences that you are able to reach. This is a country that has a huge potential. If we are able to move successfully towards democratization, given our dynamics, being a very small nation of a little over 1 million, one language, no issues of tribalism, we can really be a beautiful example of how democracy can work, and really be an antithesis of what we're seeing in other African countries where political pluralism has really brought about problems. So, but we need to be able to be assisted to transition peacefully. We have not been here ever before. This is the first of us. We have never seen so many lives being lost in this manner. We have never seen the government, consolidating power in the manner it is, and being so decisive in stifling voices of opposition. So we need all the help you can get, and we can assure you that there are outfits in Eswatini that are capable, that are willing to work, that are bona fide Swazi, that can assist, accompany Eswatini to a better country. So we really would appreciate any help that we can get. Otherwise, we also want to acknowledge the help of the diplomatic corps in Eswatini, especially the EU and the US Embassy here. They've really been working. Sometimes we know that they need to work behind the scenes, but they've been quite bold in voicing out where they've thought things are not going the right way. But clearly, they've been speaking to a leadership that is not so willing to bring about change. So we realize that things are going to be difficult, that we will not be assisted really by someone else to be liberated, but we need to do as much work as we can ourselves, but we will need to get all the support that we can get. Be my potential. Thank you.
Ashley, I know you served as moderator, but do you have any parting thoughts for us?
I do, Niamani. I think that the one thing that both my comrades didn't speak about was some efforts by the churches to convene a conversation amongst stakeholders in Eswatini, because I think to have a united voice is going to be critical if you're going to successfully lobby the international community to put appropriate pressure on the regime for change. And I think the two are they're two sides of the same coin. The only time you'll get solidarity from abroad is if the people affected by the situation are speaking with a fair degree of unity and common purpose. So I think that's quite important. Second thing that I want to mention is, I hate to say it, but in South Africa, when there were service delivery protests and you'd see the tires burning, it was called the smoke that calls. So the only time people seem to listen is when the tires were burning and there was smoke in the air. So especially when you have a recalcitrant regime, I'm afraid your skill levels at community mobilizing and organizing are going to have to be top-notch. And the final point is, in all of these processes, it's the availability of a network of resources. ACT Ubumbano is a network that works with faith-based organizations. We've got to talk. We've got to talk. If we don't talk, and if we don't talk to each other about what the best way of doing this is, we're going to be beaten. So let's Niamani, you've actually brought together, you've connected me to these two individuals in a way that I otherwise might not have been connected. So for that, I'm grateful. I'm looking forward to continued debates and discussions with both Melusi and Lomcebo, as well as other people in the region. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Melusi and Lomcebo and Ashley, for taking time to share your insights. Ashley, thank you for helping to connect us and bring this together. We work to highlight the issues that we think should be on the radar of private funders who are funding in Africa. And as we have underscored that even though this particular session was about eSwatini, that the conditions that civil society is operating under in eSwatini also exist in various degrees in other countries. And so it's really important for those who are interested in supporting civil society organizations to have an understanding of the stress and the work, but also the possibility for change.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations With. We hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our website at africagrantmakers.org and join our mailing list. Until our next Conversations With, be well.